My name is Terry Jones. I work on the Highland Software Government team, but before I came to Highland, I was an OnBase user. I was an OnBase customer, and one day I got a phone call. It's kind of a funny story because the day I was sort of interviewed, which at Highland is an interesting thing, Bill Premer was on the phone, but it was also the day that we had gotten our 5,000th customer. So this is 2005, and the party had already started at Highland. So it was a relatively easy interview because they had apparently brought many festive beverages and things on the front lawn, and that was the start of my time at Highland. But before that, I had implemented OnBase and done a bunch of other data systems for my department, which was the Arizona Department of Housing. And I ended up as an IT director mostly because I was the geekiest person in most of the departments I'd worked at. So I worked at the state level, I worked at the county level, and at one point at a county that had just implemented Windows NT, its early iteration. That's a joke for you guys. The contractor came in and implemented it, did the networking, walked away from the terminal, and never told them the password. The good news was the password was password. So it was just the first thing I tried, which won me an offer of a job to be an IT director for county government, even though I knew nothing about Windows NT and only used Novell. That's another joke for you guys. So anyway, I have a long history of inheriting IT jobs, but then eventually, by the time I got to Arizona and when I bought OnBase, I was a little bit smarter. This session is a pet peeve of mine, primarily because I'm really interested in helping you plan and do a better job around IT. I'm interested in having you have somewhat of a template and to think more clearly at the beginning, so as you're going through it and when you get to the end, it's better than you thought it would be. And if you were in here listening to Dan, he did a great job of quantifying the experience of Ottawa County. So seldom do I see that good of a job being done amongst our government customers. And we have almost 1,800 government customers now of that 12,700. So this, like I said, this has been one of my pet peeves. But I also want to talk a little bit about managing and measuring impacts, and then of course, the trendiness of IT trends and dealing with your constituents. So it's going to be an interesting moment. And I've done this a couple times now and to different audiences. So first of all, have you ever been told to find a solution? Just maybe someone walks in your office and says, fix it with IT. I had that happen. Do you ever buy a solution that the users wouldn't use? You're currently going through that. I bought 3 different data systems that the users refused to use before I got smart and dug my heels in and thought a little harder about it. So like I say, I have pet peeves about this one. Did you ever have a project go over budget? Yeah. I had a tiny bit of that, but not too often. And then, do you detect in your organizations that there's some avoidance of technology because sometimes the projects in the past didn't go that well, and now people are sort of like, no, I'm not doing it. I mean, this is apart from the paradigm changes that Dan was talking about and this idea of mobile that David was talking about and all these things that come at us all the time because technology changes. The general perception of avoiding technology at the government level pops its head up here and there. And these are the things that get in the way of how you do your planning and your selecting of IT. But I really think that it all starts with how we select. And that one of our challenges is that our procurement hasn't really kept up. In a traditional world, and I was in the state, so you're going to have to do a little translation, but depending on the size of your county, you probably experience some cognitive dissonance when you talk to folks who are very involved in procurement, because their paradigm is about protecting taxpayer dollars. Sometimes it's about the federal programs that we get money from that require us to do things in certain ways. And one of my jobs that I had for the state of Maine was to teach people these regulations. And I still am challenged by that kind of outlook because it was established for a commodity buy. It's about buying a fire truck and a stapler and reams of paper and maybe file cabinets. it goes to the lowest price, which in most cases makes a lot of sense for that stuff, unless of course the paper fuzzes up the printer or the reused ink cartridges actually leak in the printers. Sometimes I can make those points with folks. But you can understand why when you try to do that with IT, it's kind of like in the old days when you could afford a Tootaloop. Does anyone know what a Tootaloop was? I'm going to date myself. So a Tootaloop was this really slammin' cool radio that I got when I was a little kid. It was shaped like this, but you could twist it, and it had AM. Yes. You know, you bought a Tootaloop, it cost my parents $10. You get the speaker you asked for when you spend $10. IT is kind of like that. You know, a lot of times the cheapest solution is not the one that's going to serve you best going forward. And so you see the problem with like a commodity buy approach and a bottom line approach to IT. But we also have other challenges. It's the solution versus the program. Used to be easy, we'd buy Microsoft Word. Does anyone remember WordPerfect? Yes, we hated giving that up, right? And even now, well, maybe not. I went to law school, so we were interested in those great footnotes and things. But even now, Office 365 is changing that pricing structure. And that's just another example of our procurement having some significant challenges to deal with, because as things are priced as a solution, and we do this to you at Highland, you buy the modules that you need to use. We think that's a good idea because you buy what you need, right? Because who has ever used some of those data analytics tools in Excel? Probably not. Maybe it'd be cheaper if you didn't have to buy them. I don't know. But the challenge of cobbling together a solution out of the pieces, the way the vendor carves it up versus I'm just going to buy Microsoft Word for 50 users is another challenge for us, because the solution aspect includes professional services. And we include things like a fixed and firm price, also known as producing shivers to the service people. And I remember when Highland came to install, I said, just tell me how much it's going to cost, and then I'm going to add the travel in, because if I don't add the travel in into the services line, you're going to have to live on the government per diem in Arizona, which is $48 to stay in a hotel room and $24 to eat. So I jiggered things around, but our standard terms and conditions really don't reflect that. And our procurement staff may not have technology expertise to really understand how to adjust the terms and conditions for the ultimate goal, which is to get your money's worth, to have a contract that protects you, to have a contract that manages your liability, to have a contract that deals with what your funders are asking for. So there's plenty of stuff there. And then in the end, when you have to respond, and I'll just share a moment of my personal pain, when we have to respond to an RFP and it becomes this big, you and I both know that you never read all that, right? And there's some people that are going through and doing the threshold review and checking that off. But what has happened over time, and I have a couple of customers in other communities that have told me that they've been working with a great startup company in their community, creating jobs in their community. And that startup will not participate in your procurement because the response burden is too much for a small company, which is everything we hate about trying to use our obvious economic power as communities towards maybe our local job creators, but certainly small businesses, which are really the economic engine of the United States. So we got all kinds of problems under that has our procurement kept up question. And when you add to that our staff in IT may have gone down, so we have less people to help procurement, and that technology is changing. So if our procurement period looks like a year, the technology world is going to look a lot different in a year. So we have all kinds of reasons to go look at our procurement and to ask ourselves if it's the right thing to do. Which is why I love what David said this morning about shared services and about you guys getting together to do your procurement. Because I think that you can compress that timeline and you can band your buying power together to get better prices and also to share your expertise. And Washington County is a classic example of that. One of ImageSoft's end users, they share their OnBase system with Ann Arbor, Ann Arbor had great GIS capability. They share that back to the county. And that's a wonderful way for us to kind of deal with some of these challenges. But I think when all is said and done, one of the reasons that we have trouble with our procurement and that we fall out of love with our vendors that we buy IT from, or as one of them once said, when we're done with the running through the daisies period, that's when it all gets ugly. It's because we're not sure what success is. And I'll give you an example. I worked at the Department of Housing, and I had some folks that worked for me, and one day one of them called me just last year, and he said, Terry, can you explain the cloud to me? I said, sure, Michael. What are you going to do with it? And he said, I don't know. A vendor came in, and Michael's father is the chairman of a tribe in Arizona called the Wallapai. And he sits on a board of a nonprofit. And he said, well, a vendor got time, and he says we have to be on the cloud. I said, okay. I said, Michael, does your cell phone work when you're up? You know, the Wallapai tribe is just south of the Grand Canyon, a little bit left of center. He said, well, sometimes. And I said, well, Michael, if everything's in the cloud, how will you connect to it when you're up there? I said, oh. So for him, success may have looked like chasing the latest trend, but understanding what it looked like for his organization, or as I like to say, what do you really need to get done, is part of the challenge. So sometimes when we read RFPs, I'll see someone saying, we need this kind of system. What I don't see in the RFP is a description from them, probably in non-technical language, that says what success is going to look like. And I got smarter as time went on. I would write this little essay at the beginning of the RFP, and I would put it in the contract, and it would say, this is going to do this for the user. The user's going to need 2 clicks to get anywhere they want with this website. The website navigation must provide these things. So I gave them kind of my end game of what I needed the outcome to be. Now you tell me, Mr. Brainy IT person, how we're going to get there. But I do not want to go through an exercise of checking off, yes, you can double click and highlight a word. I don't want to get down there. I need to get to what success looks like for my organization. And there's a couple things to think about that specifically. And that is, how will you ever know if the vendor understands what you're asking for if you don't articulate a vision and then go back from there and say, how are you going to get there? And I would say clutch onto that tightly, because sometimes I'm not sure if the vendor hears that. I work in marketing now. I can write beautiful stories. I do it all the time. But that isn't necessarily your story, and it may not be success for your organization. But the other thing that really bothers me, and this, for all of you sitting here thinking, I was inspired by that technology conversation, the scope creep is what makes you fall out of love with your IT vendor. Because if you didn't have clarity of thought about the phases that you signed the contract for, if you didn't know what success was, it's hard for you to say that to the vendor. And I'm not going to apologize for vendors in professional services, but I will tell you from my own experience that at times I didn't have enough clarity of understanding to convey that to the people that came in to set up the system. Sometimes I had to play with the system myself to then be able to go back and articulate to them what I needed it to do. That's okay, I had time to do that. You probably don't. And it's a little bit like when you go to the doctor and they say what's wrong. Now, if I say my neck hurts, and I don't say a little bit more about, well, it was in here and I was doing a shower yesterday, I was really tense about my speech, you know, and I was doing this. I mean, maybe the doctor can't really diagnose the problem. If you don't understand what your outcome is and then articulate that to the vendor, when they try to configure what is now a solution instead of just drop in Microsoft Word, which has basically got what it's got, you're going to have trouble staying inside the scope that you put in the original RFP. And frankly, why would you know what to put in there? You're not the expert. What you are the expert on is what you need it to get done for you. And getting things done is a non-technical statement, and we'll talk more about that. But in my general view of the trends I've seen, when you look at the headlines and you think of healthcare.gov, and you think of huge ERP solutions, which will never happen again in Michigan as long as David's there, but you'll see Texas suing someone, you'll see Virginia suing someone, you'll see the Georgia Technology Authority suing people because they thought they understood what they were going to get, and they didn't, and it cost more money, and then it broke. And I would offer that understanding what success is a big piece of that, and that should be articulated in a non-technical way. So, my theory about how to help yourself with this for success and positive results are a couple of things. I loved, by the way, what Dan was saying earlier about his two-tier approach to RFPs. Like, you write the first one, and this is about IT, and this is maybe about security, it's about your existing architecture, and making that stuff work within that world. But then he had that second tier, which I just love, which is talking to frontline users and doing what I call a more informal discovery. When I decided to do OnBase, I picked it, then I had to go through some procurement hurdles, although I did sole source it, which I'm still pretty pleased about. One of the things that I had to do was really sit down with a number of people in my department. I had to get my executives to talk about how it was going to change our lives almost a year before we could actually buy it based on what our fiscal cycles were and things like that. So I did what you would call both formal and informal discovery. I got something from Highland to help me kind of conduct a more formal discovery and get that going on my own, because that helped me understand. But I also sat down and talked to a lot of people again and again to figure out what their concerns were. That's change management, and we'll get back to that. But I would offer that success has probably 3 components to it in a non-technical way. First of all, how you support the executive suite, because they're going to sign off and they're going to approve it, and that might also include the elected officials, but it probably doesn't. The second thing is the managers. They're in the middle, which means they apologize up and they apologize down. Their responsibility is typically for that business team that they manage to achieve their objectives. It's often about compliance, it's about how they use the money, it's about how fast they process. And then there's the basic users who will simply right-click and print that file if you don't turn that functionality off, and if you don't make them happy, and if you don't listen to them. And I think the success, the project outcome that you're pondering, has to include those 3 groups minimally, and probably a conversation around elected officials to the extent that they touch your life, because again, they're going to be the ones out there either trumpeting your success or blaming it on you one way or the other. So the frontline users are often the people that are left out of the equation. So when you're working on your contracts and a vendor's going to come in and deploy IT type solutions for you, normally there's a part in the contract that says who you have to provide as on-staff resources. And they often leave behind the less glamorous roles. But I would offer that those are the people that undercut the change management and the actual value of the system, because there's many, many more non-glamorous people in government than there is glamorous people. And so getting the frontline users involved early on was a big part of why the OnBase deployment went better than some of the other adventures I had. But there's other success factors. I mean, first of all, users and user adoption is important, and the ease with which that goes, I think, reflects back to some extent on your consultative process at the beginning. Not always. Some people are going to dig their feet in. But I will tell you that I had a person who worked for me. She was one of my data people. And she just hated the idea of going paperless. She'd been trained by HUD, who tells you that if it isn't there in a piece of paper in the file, it didn't happen. And she did not believe me when I said we could do this. So what I did was I made her the OnBase evangelist. She reported to me so I could do that. I asked her to go around and talk to the different business units when they had their little staff meetings to really kind of talk about what their concerns were, because I felt like she was very approachable and she was a little bit skeptical. And she would also listen to them and be empathetic to the challenges they were facing, because they were, in fact, her challenges. So I co-opted the revolution there. But I also had to think about ROI and total cost of ownership. Total cost of ownership was how I actually was able to sole source OnBase, because of the integration tool and the cost of custom coding. And that was based on some general guidelines that our centralized IT oversight board had in the state of Arizona. So I guess my point about success factors is, while I think it's important for you to have a non-technical outcome kind of statement in there, I think you also have to think about the other masters that you serve. And having an ROI is entirely possible out of OnBase, but it may be harder depending on the mission of where you start, and the total cost of ownership is almost always better with something like OnBase, but that's got to be part of your equation. Because if you go back to what I said about my TUDA loop, or maybe we'll call it the TUDA loop corollary, the cheapest solution is almost never the one that's going to have the long-term good total cost of ownership. So you should be suspicious, and you should ask questions and think a little harder about that. So I think that success for us is not necessarily a technical conversation. It's about adoption, and it's about knowing where you want to go and making the IT people describe what the software functionality or solution functionality is to get you there. But you should hold fast to the non-technical conversation. Another part of my challenges as I go out and talk to our OnBase customers is wrapping our arms around managing and measuring impacts in general. I think this has gotten better in government. When I started public policy school was the year that Reinventing Government came out. And that shook up a lot of things. Now, the mayor of Indianapolis, he busted a few union contracts. He outsourced things that had never been outsourced. And all of a sudden, there was this entirely other paradigm. I was working in the state of Maine right after that, and that was the first time that we started to talk about performance measures. So I'm talking about 1994. And every state legislature after Oregon started to pause and pass these kinds of performance-based budgeting. And then they realized that zero-based budgeting was really hard. And it made everybody angry at once because everybody looked like they were going to get no money. And if you think about our current Congress and how it would play out if we had zero-based budgeting, eek. You know, there's some sort of middle ground there that makes a lot of sense. Understanding what we get when we invest the money, feeling comfortable with what that is, that's okay. I'm not sure how we could do that today at the national level, but my history has been trying to think about the measures that are effectively telling the story of any investment that you make in government, not just IT, except for now I think that our staffing level, the expectation of our constituents, and just the people that we're starting to employ in government expect technology to be a huge part of the equation. So we've got to think about measuring impacts. And what I've got for you for most of the rest of this conversation is a whole just dump of impacts that go across our portfolio in OnBase and try to really help you think through some different ways you could measure the impacts. And I think also they have applicability for other types of investments you would make. So the first thing I would say about impacts and the success question is we always have one interesting sort of difference from the private sector. And I'm kind of a brat at times about the private sector, even though I work for the dark side now. And one of the things I say is, what is the ROI of protecting someone's civil rights? That's a hard thing to talk about. You know, we put policemen on the street because we hope that they're there and we never need them to do any of the more terrible things that they have to do. So we always have to start with our mission, our goals, our statute, our mandate, our funders, the codes that we pass, and the ordinances that we have as we start to think about what success means. Because we are grounded in those things. And sometimes it's a mission statement that tells us what our measures would be. Sometimes our funders tell us what our measures will be. We have mandates now around how fast your plan review process will happen, or how many days you have to file something. I mean, you have to look at that as a basis. And if, in fact, you have those types of rules for the department that you're expanding your OnBase to or adding IT to, you've got kind of an easy measure because you're probably going to go for 100% compliance with whatever those are. So you always have to start with those pieces. But you always have to continue that by having education and training. So let's say you were going to rewind the tape and you were going to buy an ECM solution. How much did you really understand about ECM when you started? We know about the word going paperless, but think now about how you're using ECM. What did you really know now that you've seen what you can do? Or even what some of the more advanced people like Ottawa County have continued to do over several years. How would you know? Well, the answer is you come to things like this. And it is also that if you're starting to buy a technology, maybe you're going to look at mobile devices, you're going to look at a solution to manage your mobile devices, you're going to look at solutions to manage security, that you have a parade of vendors come in and educate you and ask them to educate you a little bit about that. That's been a hard thing in some worlds around our procurement rules, because sometimes we view that as undue influence. But frankly, if you bring in 4 or 5 vendors, you're also seeing whether you like them or not, whether they have any sort of expertise, whether they can talk to you, whether they're willing to do it at all. And by doing that education and training all those other people that you're going to do your formal and informal discovery with, you are creating a more effective discovery process when you ultimately do your contracting. So you've got to think about, as you look at procurement and selecting technology, what things you're going to do the education and training, and how you're going to spread that amongst those 3-ish groups that you have to talk to: executive, manager, frontline user. You have to have that frontline user input. So a lot of times when we write requirements, and actually normally in a longer session, I show you one that I wrote that I'm so embarrassed about now. The first thing is you get 35 points for ease of use. Now, if you are doing a software solution and you are reading a piece of paper, how do you award points on ease of use? I can turn pages. What does that say about the solution? I'm so embarrassed when I show it. So, but getting user input is a very important piece of crafting the right things to judge on, right? That it does this navigation in 3 clicks, something like that. And then finally, as we talked about, you got to know where you're going. You got to know your destination. So maybe your target is a version of the performance measure. 100% of the documents that go through here will make it through our process in this many days, and it needs to go through these 3 people to do that. So education, user input, outcomes, always grounded in the mission, goals, statute, ordinance, funder, mandate kind of stuff that we have to deal with. But that being said, when you get to the point where you're actually on the ground and you've picked and you've installed, you start with the outcomes. Because once you're under contract, once the vendors are back, you're seeing a whole other group of people than you talked to during the RFP process. You probably remember this, right? Or you, and I hope this isn't true, sometimes our procurement takes so long that a whole other set of people have taken over at that company, because sometimes the ball moves. So you have to start with your outcomes again, but also because you need to go back to what you said you wanted to get done to avoid things like scope creep and the fact that you will later hate the vendor if the scope creeps and the budget goes over. Then is when you have to develop your measures, and I'll get back to that. And then you have to do the really important thing, which is change management. Remember when I said back at the beginning, did you ever have users say, I'm not going to use this? Well, I did. And 3 systems later, I finally got one that they were willing to use. Luckily, these were only $8,000 systems, but that was supremely annoying. So you have to manage your change, and I'll explain more about that as I go forward. So to start at your measure equation, you have to think about what I said. How do you measure success? Because that's going to give you the clues you need about what to measure. But I can't stress enough how important it is to do baselines. Too often, I come to sessions and I talk to OnBase government users and they say, we love OnBase. And I said, really? Yeah, it's so much easier. I said, wow, do you know how much time you're saving? No. I just know this feels much better, which I'm always very happy about. So if you're really stuck, you start with cost and time. And I'll give you an example. I did learn my lesson over some of my years of buying software. The first thing I did was pick the thing that I hated the most. Because when you torture IT, one of the things they get to do is to give you a solution that fixes IT's problem. So people used to lose my vacation requests. I don't know what it was, but it was uncanny. It was this little piece of paper like this. It was about this size. It was carbonized triplicate. And we spent $15,000 a year printing that form. And I would fill it out in advance to ask for vacation. My boss would sign it. And we each had our piece that we would keep, except for the piece that came back to me with approval had to be signed by everybody. Classic workflow problem, right? Yeah. Well, they lost it all the time. So the first thing that we did, which took us about a morning, was recreate that form electronically. And then we taught people how to use it. It routed automatically based on who my supervisor was. And then it routed to Patsy, who was in charge of keeping it. And she still had to print out a version at the end because it was HUD and attach it to my timesheet. But they never lost my vacation request again. But the important part of that was a few things. I knew that that thing cost us $15,000. So right out of the chute, I saved us money. And that was an important thing to do. I knew that we lost these things all the time. So I already knew that there was a time factor involved. So I carefully chose what project to start with because I knew there was money involved and I knew there was time involved. But also what that did for me is it got everyone in my department using workflow. If they wanted to take a vacation, they had to use it. That was the only way they could do it. I was able to have it route, and people liked that they got the email that said, hey, your vacation has been approved. And they kept that. And it was just this tiny little thing to deal with the change management issue. But it was like a three-fer. I helped with the change management, but I also saved time, and I sure did save money. So I look for things like that to start that are small miracles in government, and also that it was automation, which is ultimately where I wanted to go for my department. And there were all kinds of reasons why automation makes sense, and I'll talk about that. But I also was interested in things that were a little bit more, how would you say, esoteric. How fast did it take, could people find the information they need? In other words, time to retrieve. How fast could we make processing go? And how fast could we take a decision that normally requires routing of paper documents? So let's keep going. Let's think a little bit about that. Because really what that's about is efficiency. I mean, we can talk about money in government, and it's never bad to save money. But in general terms, that money usually goes somewhere else, right? It may not reduce the overall budget of government. What we really hope to do is, to measure efficiency. And by the way, they're going to post these slides, so that's the good news. Even though I know you've got 400 gig of storage. I always run out of photo, yeah. So I really want you to think about efficiency in government. Because we can always save money, but it may not depress the overall budget number that goes to county government or state government, truly. What I want to know is, how fast can people retrieve? Do they have fast access to information everywhere they go? Are we leveraging the data that they may be typing somewhere else? And we had a rule, we type once. So anything that I typed into my data systems became a part of my OnBase system for autofill keywords. And later on, you can push that data around, as they were saying this morning. I wanted to know how fast people could go between tasks, because that's a classic loss of efficiency and effectiveness in government. I wanted to know how easily they moved between key solutions, which is why I had Application Enabler, because we spent our day in data systems to report to HUD, but we had to consult documents to update the data systems. So I needed to know about moving between key solutions. I needed to know about how fast things moved between departments and that there was zero loss of documents, which I know you guys know all about. Something that I added in, which maybe wasn't so much of a problem then for me, but a lot of people have been talking about the challenge of having reduced staff and having staff understand the priority of what must be done next. That's an important piece of effectiveness, because if your inbox looks like this because there's less staff than it used to be, and it's all paper, how do you know which thing to do first? So one of the coolest things about OnBase for us was that you could look in workflow and you could see it. But importantly, that workflow was using a timer to remind me, and maybe even sadly escalate it to my boss if I didn't get it done in time. So I was interested in things that reach out and grab the staff to make sure they meet a mandate or a deadline or a code or an ordinance. So efficiency in government is even better than saving costs and time, because in the end, as David said this morning, we're bringing government to our constituents. And this kind of efficiency is an important way to do that. So I'm looking for things like, how long did it take to complete a task before and after? How many tasks per whatever unit per hour am I doing? Have I reduced the steps? And I had a classic situation where I went in and I looked at my files, and our files used to have those tabs, and there were 6 tabs. And flipping back and forth was so annoying that people copied the same document 6 times and put it under each tab. See, they knew they wanted to reduce the flipping steps. They just did it by making the file 6 times greater. So there are things that we do in government for processing that are 100% driven by the paper, right? So I wanted to know about reduced steps. You should be looking for that in other systems. Like when we look at data systems, they should be taking care of some other things. I love the idea of simultaneous review and access, because so many processes in government became linear because we can't simultaneously access the file. Or we need to collaborate and we need to see what one person did before the next person can do it. Which, if you think about it, is our classic process. I will only sign off after the budget person signs off. Well, what if you could all look at it at the same time and collaborate? You know, we have a collaboration module in OnBase. You can see that real-time collaboration happening, or you can use the sticky notes. So I was really interested in that simultaneous review and access, because we had developers that we funded, and they were pretty cranky when they had to hold their construction financing for longer. And process transparency has become very important to all of us, because when we have to answer to constituents about why something isn't done, I wanted to know that I can see what's going on. And finally, that we're bridging solutions. So my idea of measuring the impact and being able to describe the impact is a much bigger conversation than just costs and time. And so even though we have the easy ones that we've been talking about, which I would add in, and by the way, I should say that my OnBase solution was about $180,000. After I bought it, Highland did some much better pricing around workflow, which would have changed that number significantly. And that also included hardware. I had to buy servers and storage is amazingly cheap now. But to do an ROI in 18 months, just flat out on that, my estimate was that OnBase would save each staff person in my office 20 minutes a week. And I took the median wage between our director and our lowest paid person, multiplied that by 20 minutes, multiplied it by, you know, how many days we work. And that gave me an ROI on $180,000 in 18 months. That was a really fun, tiny little exercise, because what ultimately happened was a few things. And some of you that have heard me speak before, we had to pay back money to HUD because we failed on a compliance task, which was essentially the review of a document. Nobody even noticed that that document hadn't come in before the check left the building. That's an easy one for OnBase. So there are things like that that you can find as ROI as well. And that was the day that the director came to my office and said, you need to find a solution now. And that was sort of where my OnBase adventure started. But anyway, these are the easy ones. Other measures, though, are much more interesting. Like, are we eliminating duplication? Are we meeting our compliance concerns, even though we may have reduced our staff? And maybe we bought out some of our most experienced staff and gave them early retirement because that made sense financially. Are we seeing good customer satisfaction? And one of the things that happened that wasn't an OnBase project for me, but we created a website. We posted most of our developer stuff. So when I say developer, I mean some folks that get together to build apartment complexes in your community. It's sort of complicated financing. Once we started to put things out on our website so that they could just pick it up electronically and not have to call us for a copy, our customer satisfaction surged upward. That's a legitimate thing to look at if you're using some of your IT for constituent-facing activities. Also, certainly on the health and human services side in using OnBase, we see reduction of backlogs. I mean, we have people that are holding their own even though their staff is reduced 30 or 40% over time. And this is 100% a function of getting rid of the paper. And so the caseload per worker has gone up. Remember I said tasks per unit, per hour, that kind of stuff. Things like inspections per day and things that the time in their day is increased simply by avoiding stupid things like having to carry files and then putting them back. And then any kind of time to stuff is good. Another one of my favorites is over-the-counter time. As you have that speed and faster retrieval, people who do have to travel to your county or city hall can really come in and your staff can find it. But there's other things that people talk about, like what is the cost of doing things the same way? I would offer that that is the gradual loss of relevancy to your constituents. My nieces are 8. I have twin nieces. They're fabulous. They've really never talked to me on the phone. We only webcast. We do FaceTime. I will get a letter from Flory occasionally that says, Terry, I want to do a FaceTime with you soon. They live in upstate New York. They don't even understand the idea that we didn't get a telephone in my house till I was in 7th grade. And then it was a party line. They don't understand how we got by without, these basic pieces until 7th grade. And I said, because my aunt across the road had a phone. I mean, if we needed a phone, we went across the street. But there is a cost to doing things the same way, and it's across all the things we're talking about. There is also the idea that the trek that you have for technology is part of your positioning for the future. We have a lot of folks right now that are replacing their ERP solutions because they cannot be mobile. They cannot offer a portal to vendors. They can't offer the ability for people to approve an invoice, from their phones. So there's always this idea that you're going to have to get new technology because you can't do some things that have just become fundamental. But also that what you buy is something you can build on. So what is really neat in your selection process is to understand what the update process is. So the fact that there will be an OnBase 14 this year and there will be an OnBase 15 next year is very important because you know that the technology that you invest in is going to keep trending and doing additional work. So when you heard Bill talk about we can have billions and billions of images, that wasn't the case when I started with OnBase. When you hear him talk about a mobile app, we have one. So when you're selecting your technology and you're thinking about ways to measure, you need to think about how they're updating. Have they been around long enough? Do they update every year so that you've got that option of being able to stay there and still be positioned for the future? And then a lot of people talk about other value factors. This comes out of my public policy training. What does it mean to your constituents that you're relevant? Does it mean you have an app? Maybe. Some apps make a lot of sense to me, like transit. I was driving down here and just loving all the good stuff that Lansing had done to preserve the buildings and have all this kind of funky stuff. Maybe the tourism people need an app to make sure that I find all that stuff when I'm visiting. Then there's the social benefit issue. You saw Bill's example this morning of using GIS in conjunction with the folks that have applied for assistance because they're living with HIV, in conjunction with where they can receive Ryan White services. There are social benefits to having those technologies, which may be meaningful to the folks you're talking to. We know about improved government operations. We know about things that have to be strategic and political, which is often why we choose things that are constituent-facing first when we ask elected officials what they'd like to have. And of course, there's the overall cost savings, because there's a general idea that there's always more work that government could do if we could keep our costs in line. So you got all kinds of value factors that you could build things on, but I would offer these as advanced ones. If, in fact, we accept that the constituent of 2020 is going to be plugged in, they expect to use their app. They may have never owned a computer. They may have gone straight to tablet and smartphone. We have to think about what our website looks like and how it's used, where the incoming usage is coming from. And we have to think about our IT investments to backstop the value of that website. One way to know if the website is valuable is if people actually come there and how often they come there. And where they go when they're there should help to inform you about which technologies you should select and which projects make sense, because the constituents in a very real way are telling you what it is that they want to get on a website. And that should help you shape your IT roadmap and help you select which vendors to work with. So for example, when we finally did come up with a public access constituency license, which I know you memorize, one of the reasons for that was the logical outcome of using OnBase was that we create a window into it so your constituents could search OnBase and have the same joy that you have with easily finding documents that they used to have to call you for or come to your office to get. So I would want to know how often people are calling the office for documents. And I would want to use that time factor to consider whether a public access license into the website makes sense, since it's a penny a constituent to buy the license based on your population. It's unlikely that your annual cost of taking the phone calls, doing the photocopying and the printing doesn't exceed the cost of a penny a constituent. So looking at website usage and visits and understanding where people are going helps you inform what to select for IT. A lot of the larger customers that we have are looking for more online submission, because they know that it makes sense as their next iteration of using OnBase that they originate in an electronic way, that we never create the paper, so we never have to scan it. And by the way, we're getting them to type the data, so we never have to have our own staff type the data. And using things like Unity Forms, we can validate the data, so it's good to have them type it. So online applications and documents submitted before and after is an excellent way to look at what sort of work you're peeling away as you do your measures. We talked about units in day. Now, ripeness is an interesting concept, and that is not just because I perspire before I do public speaking. What I mean by ripeness is, in my world, in housing, when people applied for things, they had to submit supporting documents, proof of income, proof of identity. I shouldn't really be looking at that client's case file until it was ripe. In other words, they had submitted everything. And so some of our human services folks, or even our plan review folks, or even our assessor appeals, these things don't move to grab a case, one of your workers' attention until the documentation is complete. And using OnBase workflow, you could figure that out. So instead of having someone look at a pile of paper files on their desk, open each one, do some reading, check, going through the checklist, and then figuring out that 3 pieces of documentation are missing, they only start working on things that are ready for them to work. That's what I mean about ripeness and ready to move forward. And eliminating people starting to review something when they don't have the information they need to take a decision is a fair way to measure your effectiveness and your efficiency. And then, of course, there's my old favorite, which is we hope that you get more work done with less staff, because there's always more things to do in government. There's always things we could do better. And in my world, on the human services side, all the studies showed that the more human interaction people had with the support systems, the faster they get off of them, the better efficacy of a human services program. So if you can actually look people in the eye more often, you can do a better job of helping them move on to their level of self-sufficiency that you hope that they will achieve by getting that help. So we've got a lot of great things to look at, and when they post this slide deck, you can use it as food for thought as you think about your outcomes and all that kind of stuff. But we've had a lot of reduced over-the-counter times. We're definitely increasing self-service opportunities for the reasons we've talked about. We want to eliminate taking the paper at all. We love when they type, but also they expect to be able to go to the website and start their transactions with government in a self-service way. I mean, that's how they've grown up. But I think fewer calls for general information and help with applications and process is also a valid measure for you to take a look at. And then we sent out postcards, old school, hard copy. Tell us what you did. Tell us if you liked it. It was 3 questions. And actually, we got a fair number of them back. They were self-stamped, and we would we'd send them out like quarterly to people that had called in. And we got a lot of good stuff about making our website better and better, making more things available. And that all came out of a State of the State address from Janet Napolitano, who in classic government form had said, we're going to reduce this much money in postage this year in state government without a clear reason or understanding of why that was going to happen. So anyway, we got some good stuff out of doing our website, and it all came because of Janet Napolitano and her random amount of money that she put into her State of the State. The other thing I want to talk about, and actually Dan did a great job talking about it from an Ottawa County perspective, but also there was some mentions earlier, is that a lot of things when we do them in government, they implicate more than one department. And documents are shared, or they're created in one department and need to be passed to another. So there's all kinds of stuff that has horizontal value. So as you're thinking about projects, whether it's OnBase or something else, and you're trying to have a big bang for your buck, you should think about looking through it the lens of cross-department work and efficiency. Because we know about HR, and I gave you my example of, I picked that electronic form very consciously because it cut across everybody. But a lot of things cut across everybody. So something like doing agenda management with OnBase is a good sense. Doing contract management makes a lot of sense. But these processes, they don't always flow well between departments. This is where documents are lost. This is where we lose our efficiency. This is where we slow down as government. And we've got a few others that are classics, like conversations between finance and some of the people that collect fees in government, or going across public safety to courts and understanding that they all have their own files, when in fact, a file originates in investigation, it moves to prosecution, and heads to adjudication, and we simply build that file over time. There's a classic example of a possibility for eliminating duplication of effort. And when you're downstream and you're the records manager, you're going to get 3 times the paper if you're in charge of all those streams, which has come up a bit for counties. You know, then we've got some other situations where you've got to make the jump from child protective services over to the courts to take action. Or we're doing plan review, and then we inspect when the building's finally built, and then we have a hard time letting our property people know that it should be added to the property tax rolls. And how fast does it get on there? Because the faster it gets on there, the faster you get your revenue. So these are great places to look for efficiency and to think about your outcomes and to think about what success is, because cross-department work is where we lose the most time in government. It's where you'll see the duplication if you look at it in this perspective. Okay, and then of course we got the downstream records management. And if every one of these departments has their own version of the records, they get 6 times as much paper to store in the physical storage world, which is exactly what happened to Cobb County. The records manager was one of the big push people for getting OnBase because they were getting 6 times the paper because everybody was sending their records downstream to that person to manage in their offsite location. And that's before we talk about what's the real record, what's the final record, which should be stamped official. So anyway, okay, this set of slides, this portion is just to give you some ideas about how to write measures. These are real OnBase stories. The first one is the state of Pennsylvania Treasury using workflow to do their processing and wiping out processing fees that they used to pay to the Social Security Administration, and therefore saving $12 million every 6 months. A lot of these are kind of classic situations, you know, offsite storage, central solutions, eliminating paper entirely, reducing cases of paper, storage of documents. So I put this in the slide deck so you'd have a long list of things, not the least of which is when you go out and you work with your folks and you want to ask some of the frontline users, well, what would be success? What would be an outcome of an IT investment? Here's an example of some ways to write it that do not require you to be a technology genius. You don't need to know about Heartbleed or OpenSSL or any of this good stuff to be able to say, yeah, we sure would like to get our files 60 times faster, or so many times faster, or we would like to manage our workload even though we've had this much staff. I mean, these are examples of classic OnBase success that you can build on when you do your other IT selection. One of the things that I particularly like is this time to process issue. Because I think that in general, people don't necessarily mind the government spends money. I think what they need to see is improvement in the things that they deal with every day. So invoice processing for the business community, going from 2 weeks to 2 days makes a big difference in their cash flow, particularly when you're talking about small businesses in your community. If you are someone who needs health and human services, eligibility determination reducing is a difference between the safety net working and you sleeping in your car or on the street on any given night. I mean, these are very valid and important pieces. So time to process is a great type of measure in the land of technology, because I think this is one of the ways that technology profoundly changes government. At any rate, you've got all kinds of things here to use when they post the slides. I love the constituent service category because this is Marion County radically changing the wait time for vital records that they have to present simply by being able to find them faster by not going into the file room. These are also the kind of stories that you can use to build consensus if you are going to expand into one of the departments with OnBase and you're trying to talk to people about why they would want to do that. So, for our last couple of minutes, I want to do a before and after shot. One of the things that I love about our customers is they get inspired about using OnBase, but the thing I don't like is they forget to count. So one of the things we did in looking at, let's just say, agenda management, the top is the process. The things on the left are sort of the classic challenges. You might call this the business case. If I was going to write an RFP around agenda management, I would be using the classic challenges to describe my business pains. And I would expect the outcomes to be that these would be erased. I would be using the thing on the right also as part of my business pains and how I would structure my outcomes. In other words, a non-technical way to describe this would be to say we eliminate the routing of paper. We no longer retype data, it leverages data. We have a central dashboard to answer questions. We don't have to physically number the packets for agenda management. These are non-technical things that you would put into your solution description that you would expect vendors to respond to. Now, if in fact you do get an agenda management process, I'll use the OnBase example, and I'll talk about this from the perspective of some of the things we've talked about. First of all, by using electronic forms, we can leverage data that we type. We're not moving things between offices, we don't have inter-office mail, and we don't lose anything because it goes into OnBase and it stays there. And then at the mid-level of this process, and by that I mean as it's moving towards its end of getting to the meeting, we're still leveraging data. We're not using any manual systems to track, so we haven't had to create extra systems to have process transparency. We can look into a dashboard and we can see it. We're not retyping or hand numbering because we're using workflow to take care of it. There's no photocopying involved because we can deliver this electronically, or if people want to, they can print it. At the other end, we also have some other things. We can use the leverage data to do document composition to create the agenda template. And we can template the language for voting and motions. Workflow is going to track the follow-up in any sort of tabled items so we don't lose track of things that we need to comply with or that we need to follow up on. We can automatically post it to the web so people can go to the website, visit it, and see the value and have that external transparency. And we've also automated the production of the minutes packet, which eliminates manual assembly. Now, I clicked through the slides quickly. Coconino County found that this eliminated their work by at least 50% and their costs by at least 50% over the course of the year. And it was simply by bringing to bear the classic pieces of OnBase, but also understanding where your business pains were and lining those pieces up with how you would do it in OnBase. Now, when you look at your technology and you're looking at various projects, you would want to line things up in the same way and use the same kind of non-technical language to both describe what you want to happen and to describe what has to happen. So, in the land of best practices, I would say demonstrating the value is absolutely essential. You have an ongoing education problem anytime you invest dollars in technology. The reason for that is your elected officials change, your staff changes, and you may even forget, if you don't use it every day, why it was that you bought it. I think it's our obligation to explain that as IT people. You have to prepare for the paradigm change, and you do that by talking. And you need to add that, I think, to the project length. Using process maps like I just did with agenda management is a great way to explain it to people that may not even really know the process, but they need to see the functionality lining up against real day-to-day tasks to understand the impact of what you've selected. You've got to introduce users and have a plan for training, because you get new staff, you lose staff, or Highland Software releases a new version of OnBase every year, and that's a reason why you have to train. You got to report the results. You got to manage your managers by having measures, and you got to use measures that are meaningful for the language that they talk about, especially the elected officials. So when they talk about things like increased productivity, that you have measures that match that kind of philosophy. So you can manage the managers and manage the frontline people. I always ask to report. I'm brave enough to say, this is in fact what I did, and this is what we're having. We persistently see that our best customers, the ones that keep moving forward, have user groups and events to teach them. So if you're not doing that, ask ImageSoft and Highland if you need to have user events like this to help people understand, but to also broaden the contact across your organization.